And what I realized when I was drafting the article was that I was actually undervaluing the role of intuition. And I think I would argue that we kind of systematically as a society undervalue intuition as something that's lesser than, let's say, the rational part of our brains.
Welcome to How I Decided, a show where regular people share important decisions they've made so that we can learn from them in making our own life decisions. Building a successful tech startup is probably one of the hardest things that anyone can try to do. It requires a ton of personal sacrifice and dedication, but often people feel empowered to do it because they feel so passionate about the problems they're solving for. But what if you're a founder who's been working on your idea for a while and things aren't quite panning out the way you hoped? Maybe you're also feeling a little burnt out by the work. This is what my friend, former boss, and current mentor, Aashay, was thinking in the fall of 2022. Aashay and I met at a startup called Edgi Learning in the summer of 2022, where Aashay was a co-founder and I was an intern. In this episode, Aashay and I discuss why it's so important to pay attention to your feelings as you go about your work and your career, and also how to balance intuition versus reasoning in your decision making. I'm really excited to share this episode with all of you. And now let's jump back to the fall of 2022.
Through the summer, we were working on something quite specific at Edgy, and it was this idea that we could create a new kind of social experience primarily for high school students that was focused on learning rather than kind of mindlessly scrolling on social media. But what I guess one of the big learnings we had was we were not able to really scale it to a point where it felt like it could become a sustainable business with that particular product experience. Even though we had a couple thousand students on it, it wasn't growing fast enough. And so towards the end of the summer, really fall, a decision was made that we should focus on one particular feature, and that was EdgyBot. And the idea was to help them learn using AI. I think we immediately started to see that, okay, this is something that could be scaled much more easily. It was a simpler product, easier to focus on, especially with a tiny team. So there were a lot of good reasons to do that as a business. And we started to see much more traction. So there were positives there. But I guess I also personally started to notice that for myself, it felt less meaningful. And there was a lot of different things we had tried at Edgy before, one of which we just talked about. But it felt like we were getting away from the core of what we had started with. And when I looked at it objectively, it made sense for the business. But when I sort of subjectively thought about how I felt about it, I started to realize that it wasn't quite aligned with what I would enjoy doing. And I guess at the same time, by this point, we had been working on Edgy for a couple of years. And like any startup, the early days are a grind. And it can be, there's a lot of good there, but there are ups and downs. And so I was feeling a little bit of burnout as well. And so I think all of those factors led to a point where I started to question, is this something I wanted to keep doing or take a step back?
Yeah. And one thing I want to give context for people listening, I think for startups in general and people who are entrepreneurs know this, but to do a startup, you have a pretty big personal stake in it, right? I remember you weren't taking a salary for it. Can you just share more about like what's that like, I guess, to have that kind of investment into something where there's a ton of risk, but there's also a lot of upside as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a lot of commitment. It can become your life. It sort of does become your life. And so there's a lot of good to it because if you're doing something you really care about, then it can feel very meaningful. And it did for large chunks of it for me. But it also means that you're essentially putting away everything else in order to do this thing. Because in those early days, you need that kind of dedication to get something off the ground. And the downsides are essentially that unless you're, there's some people who could do a lot of different things and still manage their time. But for me and, probably for a lot of other founders too, it just takes up all of your attention. Even if it doesn't take up all of your time, it's just always in the back of your head. And so it helps you create this kind of siege mentality because everyone is kind of all in, especially when you're a small team. But how long can you keep that going is a challenging question. And I hadn't really thought about it, to be honest. I had my blinders on and we were just kind of go, go, go. And the goal was to make Edgy work. And that was kind of it. But when I did take even like a day to take a step back and just think about, okay, how am I feeling about this? I started to notice other things. And that's when I decided, okay, it probably makes sense to pay attention to this feeling.
I want to start to unpack this decision a little bit because I think one of the things that you're referencing here, and I've heard you talk about it a lot before, is this idea of taking a step back to kind of see what's going on around you, what your life is like, because I think it's totally accurate that a lot of times, whether or not it's like intense startup work or whether it's like you're in school or stuff or you're doing sports, you're often so focused on the day-to-day work and like getting better, which is really good, but oftentimes you could be losing the bigger picture. So I'm wondering if you have like a set strategy or, while you're kind of exploring this decision, how would you like just find this time to kind of take a step back and reflect? Because it sounds like having those was kind of part of the trigger to start to reconsider working at the startup.
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't say I have like a strong strategy. I generally tend to follow my nose. But in this case, so I had two other co-founders, Josh and Tinsley, and a couple months earlier, Tinsley had decided to take a step back as well. And so in a way that created a natural break because, again, this was someone who'd been obviously there from the beginning and we'd spent a lot of time together. And so it created a natural space for reflection. And it didn't actually happen immediately, but it was a few weeks after she made her decision. And I think it was actually right around Thanksgiving. So there was a break, just generally speaking as well. And yeah, that was a moment of just trying to think about, okay, is this right for me? I've been just sort of thinking about Edgy, but what about me? And so it was a little bit of just trying to view things selfishly, so to speak, because for the past couple of years I had at the time, it was just thinking about Edgy as a company. And so that space for reflection, I think, is really important. And even in the past, when I've had to make other decisions, being able to take that step back and give myself the space to explore what else is going on has proven to be really important. And so it was just a reminder that it was time to do that in this particular case, even though it was challenging and difficult.
Yeah. What I take away from that is so much of life, like you said, is go, go, go. So when there's a natural break that happens, I think it's like a good reminder for everyone to kind of take a time to pause. But it's also so easy, even if something like that were to happen, like you're just like, oh, okay, I still gotta like keep going and doing stuff. So I think that's one thing I admire about your decision is, and you in general, is that you're willing to take that sort of pause and think about it. And also just wondering, I actually don't know this about you, is like when you're talking about these kind of reflective moments, are you just sitting in a room thinking about it, or are you writing it down? Like, are you talking to someone about it? I know people have different strategies for how they process these sort of things.
Yeah, that's a good question. In now I actually have a set of practices that I like to use frequently and just make it a part of my day to day, basically. So that includes meditation, it includes journaling, and probably most importantly, also just talking to people that I trust and I know have my best interest in mind. With the Edgy decision specifically, I didn't have most of those practices. So it was mostly relying on talking to, again, people that I trust and thinking about it, exploring what other things I might want to do and why. And and then also, part of it was just thinking about what does this mean for Edgy? Is that going to be okay? How is Josh going to take this? Especially considering Tinsley had just made that decision not so long ago. And in that moment, it was kind of hard to, it still felt really hard to separate myself out of this bigger decision or what it might mean for the company. But it happened over a few weeks. It wasn't like an overnight decision. So I had time to think about it and talk to a bunch of people. And ultimately, I think it came down to realizing that this feeling that I have is not going away. And so that made it really clear for me. That's what gave me some conviction that this is the right decision, because it wasn't just a fleeting thought. It stayed with me for several days and weeks.
Right. This thought of, if I'm not here, I can be exploring. And maybe could you share like what are some of the things that you're interested in exploring if you weren't to, working on this startup idea? Like what are the things that got you excited? And
Yeah. So initially it was really just to slow things down, actually, because as we've talked about, working on a startup is a big commitment. And those 2 years felt like 5. And so just mentally, you can feel very tired. And so I just needed, I felt like I just wanted to create some space, maybe even just do nothing for a while. And then a couple of other things that were coming up that had actually previously come up in the past as well when I was working in other jobs. One of them was around writing. I'd been interested in writing for a while, never really created a habit out of it. And so I wanted to explore what that might look like if I did it more consistently, not as a career or a business or job or anything like that, just more for me personally. So really just a personal blog. And then the other thing that had come up again previously was a growing interest in philosophy and wanting to explore some of the ideas of ancient philosophy, especially. And I think the reason why that kept coming up for me was, for my undergrad, I went to business school at NYU. And so that was a very practical education, let's say. And I felt like I was missing something. I hadn't had that kind of liberal arts education that many people do go through, but and probably for good reason back then, but it felt like something I wanted to explore for myself. And yeah, that's led me to actually join a master's program that I'm doing right now in liberal arts focused on philosophy.
one of the things that I found pretty interesting about Ashay's decision is that there's the potential that someone else is impacted by whatever decision Aashay makes. And he has people that he's responsible to, like his team members at Edgi Learning. And I think if we contrast that with, my friend Harry in his first episode, really that was just a decision he made for himself and maybe for people in his family as well, but mainly for himself. And I think there's this added, unique layer of, if you're making a decision and other people could be affected by it, like let's say if Aashay leaves, that leaves a big hole in the startup, or, without him, the chance of succeeding is way less. How does that impact this decision where Aashay also has to make his own individual choice about what's best for him? And that's something that I was really looking forward to asking him about and for him to share his thoughts on.
Yeah. So one of the things I really appreciate about my experience with Edgy, especially working with Josh and Tinsley, was that we were very open in our communication, generally speaking. And so, in fact, it was Josh that kind of prompted the initial reflection, now that I think about it. Just asking the question of, is this right for us right now? Just something to think about. And I guess it had come up for him even more strongly than me when Tinsley decided to step back. And so he had asked that question. And that's what, in some ways, kickstarted this journey for me. And so when I sat to reflect, thought about it, all of these things came up. And I shared that with Josh that, hey, I am feeling some of this. I'm not sure if it's the right thing for me to keep going. And over several days and weeks, we had this type of conversation. And so he was super supportive. So that was, first off, that helped a lot, because that takes kind of, in some ways, the pressure off of you. If he had reacted with, oh no, what are we going to do? Can you rethink this decision? Are you sure? That if he had kind of second guessed my decision, then things might have even turned out differently. I'm not sure. But the fact that he was very receptive and kind of was very supportive and in helping me put myself first above this company and the team, and then just making a plan for what it would look like if I wasn't there anymore. And also, to be honest, also a realization that, yes, of course it was a small team, as you said, and I played a big role in the team, but ultimately Josh was the CEO. And so if it was him making the decision, I think it would have looked very different. So, there's just some truth in that as well. That even if I left, this company could continue. And so that made me feel better too, that, okay, it doesn't mean that I'm making a decision that affects everyone else in some kind of terminal way. And there is potentially a path to keep going. So yeah, I think all of those things, his support, talking to him, realizing that this could continue, made me comfortable to make that decision and then actually go through with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad to hear that. And I think that's just like an added layer of decisions where, when I think about some of my like most important decisions, truthfully, like the only person that's really been affected is like me, which is like, it's different, I think very different from something where you have this kind of responsibility to other people or something bigger like a company or a startup or a mission. But it sounds like that's, a really good way to go about it is just, to first talk about the people that are around you that you're working with to kind of have that honest conversation.
I'll add maybe one more thing. I think this is a little bit of a cultural thing, but I grew up in India, and there's a tendency over there to kind of focus on the collective rather than the individual. And there's a lot of good to that, I would say. But in certain situations, when you're choosing the collective over the individual, it can have a negative impact, right, on the person. And so I think that's kind of my default mode, or has been in the past at least, of thinking about others first, or thinking about the collective first. And so it was also a reminder in this case that it's okay to focus on yourself a little bit. And having that support of other people is always helpful when you're trying to kind of get out of that cultural mindset, let's say.
Yeah. And so after having this conversation with Josh, where you basically, I guess, decided and can you recall like the exact moment when you felt like you were decided, or is it just still like a process that went over time?
No, I do remember. I was back home in India when just visiting my family and some friends when I made the decision. But it had been building up for a few weeks, as I've mentioned already. And so yeah, I remember that moment and feeling mixed emotions, to be honest, at that time, because yeah, when you've been a part of something for what feels like 5 years, it was 2 years, but what felt like long, it's just, yeah, you're changing your mode of being in a big way. You're kind of shedding a big part of your identity. And so I had mixed emotions, but I also felt relief. And so that was kind of another indicator that, okay, this seems like the right decision.
What you've
Yeah.
described, I think, is one of the maybe like the misconceptions about decision making, because I feel like in like pop culture, like the movies or whatever, it like may seem like a light bulb clicks for someone, and all of a sudden they're like, oh,
Yeah.
I need to like, like pack up all my stuff and move somewhere else. And obviously it's just a movie, like they just need to show that part. But for most people, it's like several weeks long, month long process where you're kind of just like digesting it and thinking about it and imagining realistic scenarios for what would happen after.
I agree with that. It can appear like, oh wow, that was a really interesting decision someone made with so much conviction, and from the outside it can seem like it was somehow like an overnight decision. But typically, in my experience, that's just not the case. It's something you're coming to over time, trying to look at from different angles, trying to figure out what's the right framework even to make a particular decision. And often frameworks are exactly what they are. They're just frameworks, right? And so they don't perfectly fit whatever decision you're trying to make. And so there's back and forth, there's wrangling, and you don't really see any of that. It's kind of similar in a way to success stories where it seems like someone became an overnight success, but really there was a lot of other stuff that happened in the background that you just don't see or hear about.
Yeah, you read about someone's decision, you're like, wow, that makes just like so much sense. But I think I can imagine for that person, there was a time where it probably didn't make sense for them at least, and they kind of had to struggle with it. One cool thing I really want to get to is you talk about feeling a lot, and I think that's what it's kind of hinting at, is this idea of like intuition. And you recently wrote an article about when in doubt, follow your heart, which I'll link for everyone for the podcast so that you can read it. But you talk about this philosophy of life to follow your intuition and how that's really worked for you in the past. Could you just explain a little more about what that is, how you came to realize that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess first thing I want to say is this tends to work for me. It may not work for everyone. And so it's not kind of it's definitely not a panacea, and it's not a way of operating that works for everyone. And so just want to add that disclaimer, I guess. But this also came from actually several weeks of reflection on just thinking about how do I make the big decisions when they come up. And what I realized was consistently intuition played a big role in big decisions that I've made. We've talked about the Edgy decision at length, so that is one of them as well. But even other ones that I've made in the past, intuition has played a large role. And what I realized when I was drafting the article was that I was actually undervaluing the role of intuition. And I think I would argue that we kind of systematically as a society undervalue intuition as something that's lesser than, let's say, the rational part of our brains. And I'm not so sure if that's actually the case. I think both are important. So, not to lessen the importance of thinking rationally, I think that is important, but we give that a lot of daylight in our culture, and intuition is sort of this fuzzy thing that we tend to think of as less valuable. But it reminds me of this idea of a full body yes. So when you're trying to make a decision, trying to think about it in different ways, what is your head saying? What is your heart saying? What is your gut saying? And if they're all in agreement, that's a really good sign. In fact, if they're all in agreement, you've probably already made that decision because you'd likely have a lot of conviction. But typically, when you're trying to make a big decision, there isn't agreement. That's what creates this tension. And for me, what I've realized is when I have that kind of doubt, that following my heart seems like the right approach because that's what's worked in the past. And that can sound kind of hand wavy, I guess. And, what does it mean to follow your heart? And the truth is, I'm still trying to work through that myself. Like, I don't consider myself very good at understanding or noticing how I'm feeling things in my body. But I am realizing, and I've heard from other people as well, talked to a few people who rely on this a lot, is looking for signals in your body and trying to make sense of them. And that kind of, some people call it somatic intelligence, I think is important because it's kind of another source of knowledge. Because if you're like you and me, and I'm just going to put you in this bucket, but you could tell me if I'm wrong, we tend to kind of overanalyze and think through
definitely.
everything in our heads, and this can kind of break that sort of pattern, trying to look for signals in your body. And so, yeah, that for me, it comes down to that is my intuition. I have this feeling in my chest that I'm still trying to, as I said, get better at recognizing and noticing when it actually happens, that I feel something very strongly. And so when I have felt that in the past and then followed through with the decision, I've usually looked back at it in a positive way.
I love that in our conversation, Aashay and I talked about intuition because, yeah, it's one of those things I really do think is undervalued. And it actually made me just do a quick Google search about how to trust your gut when making decisions. And I came across this amazing Harvard Business Review article by Eric Bonobo that I'm going to link into the podcast so you guys can read it. But it was written in 2003. So it's been over 20 years, but reading it, it's still super relevant. And basically, it's called Don't Trust Your Gut. It's talking mainly about high stakes business decisions, but I think this applies to the same to career decisions, where the basic idea that the author is trying to make is that executives think that they can just make decisions with their gut and completely ignore reason or logic. And the idea of intuition is super attractive because it feels like this mystical power where the top people have it. And there are tons of stories of people that made these incredible decisions that made their companies really successful. And it's the idea that intuition, if you label it that way, can be really dangerous if you use it as a substitute for reason. Our brain is actually very good at making patterns where they don't even exist. So we're literally just making stuff up. But I think all that is to say that the scale between intuition and reason, there's a balance in the middle. You can think of it as a spectrum. And I think what Aashay is saying is very similar in that he's balancing his logic with intuition. It's not completely one or the other. And it's when we completely ignore one side that we run into trouble. If we completely ignore logic and data, then we're going to make bad decisions. If we completely ignore our intuition, it's also very possible that we not only lose sight of who we are, but also just overwhelm ourselves with data, and it becomes kind of this decision paralysis. And when you were dealing with this decision about leaving the startup, in terms of that feeling and internal reflection, did you try to like articulate it in any way, like for yourself, or is it just kind of something you just felt within, like maybe you couldn't exactly describe what it was?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll say that I likely need to have some story. In the case of Edgy, or me leaving Edgy specifically, it was a combination of trying to figure out what I was feeling, but you can't always you intuition literally means that you may not be able to explain what you're feeling, right? And so it's more, I use it more as a signal rather than, okay, I need to fully explain whatever is going on. So use it more as a signal to explore more and then try to think about it in a way that you can, I guess, rationalize, but you may not be able to fully explain it. And I guess I've gotten comfortable with realizing that I may not be able to fully explain it, and that's okay.
Yeah, I do think it's particular to different kinds of people and personalities. On the full body yes thing, I think I've 100% felt that way, where it's like I feel like my body's being like twisted in two different directions, and it like physically made me almost feel like a little sick almost, which was like
Mm,
weird, kind of like interesting at the same time. And one additional comment I want to make about that is, I think you're right that you and I are very similar in over analyzing stuff. And I think with particularly decision making, I think it's important to really know yourself and your own tendencies, because for us, knowing that we do like to be rational and kind of think things through really logically, it's like almost like our default setting is a little, too much to one certain way, right? So if you're aware of that, and you know that even if you feel like you're overdoing the intuition part, you probably actually aren't like that far on the other side, right? You're probably just correcting more towards the middle. And I've had several people tell me that
exactly.
they're like, yeah, dude, like the reason why I want you to choose this is because I know you're not someone who just like jumps into things randomly. Like if you were like my other friend who like just like makes stupid decisions and like doesn't think about it all the time, like yeah, I wouldn't like tell them to go that route. So it's like kind of knowing who you are, and it's like also other people kind of can sense that about you too.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And then I wanted to add one more thing on intuition. It it and it relates to experience. Intuition, again, from my experience, builds with experience. So the more decisions you make in life, the stronger your intuition should get theoretically, because assuming those decisions go the way that you expect or hope, or, so relying on your intuition, especially as you get older, I think can be a really valuable tool in your toolkit, essentially, right? So, maybe when you're younger, you have a certain way of operating and you need to think things through logically or rationally, if that's kind of how you're disposed. But as you get older and you've made certain decisions, there's this feeling, this little voice that seems obscure and is hard to explain. That trained intuition can actually be really useful.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been exploring, and I asked Harry in my last episode, is this idea of making the decision right. The idea that a lot of decisions we make, the choices are all pretty on par with each other, but it's, what you make of it once you've kind of decided to go on this path. It sounds like you kind of had a plan, but now you're, I guess, like just around or more than a year into leaving Edgy in the startup. How did you in like those initial months after try to make the decision right and try to make the most out of it?
Yeah, there were a few things. So there was, knowing that was feeling some kind of burnout, there was a conscious decision to have more self-care. And so that took different forms. I mentioned the meditation practice. That's become pretty integral to my kind of daily routine. Journaling was another one. Even just working out, like adding another day to my workout routine. So I just wanted to physically and mentally get back to a place where I felt good about myself. And then it was creating space to let things happen and kind of see where I'm feeling pulled towards. Writing was a really helpful tool as well. So I started off actually with this kind of, I guess, random in a way challenge of, oh, I just want to write 30 blog posts in 30 days as a way to get going. And that was really useful for two reasons. One, I suddenly had, working on Edgy all the time, to suddenly I could basically do nothing if I wanted to, but that would have been a hard transition. And so I felt like I needed something to anchor me. And so writing for 30 days was super helpful to kind of get me into a different routine. And then, adding the self-care routine, the writing, and then slowly just kind of working my way through, okay, what are other things I'm interested in that I might want to explore? And then test them out in small ways, experiment with them. For a while, I had this idea of what if I could acquire a small business that I didn't have to spend all my time on, and kind of in many ways the opposite of edgy. And so I spent a few months exploring that. Ultimately realized actually that's not quite me. It doesn't feel right. And so I stopped doing that. But yeah, just taking little steps towards things that had a sense for, or had some inclination towards, and then trying to figure out if that's right for me or not.
I really hope you guys enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I think Aashay is an amazing guest who has clearly, reflected a lot upon himself and understands himself. And I think that's really important for especially those who are listening who are college graduates and just getting started with their first job. And a couple of takeaways I have from this personally is just really starting to understand the feelings that you have, noticing them, even if you can't really describe them, and trying to use those to maybe signal or guide you into considering a choice or decision. Another big takeaway is there are no overnight decisions. Everyone kind of has this internal struggle, and it takes time, and it's okay if it can take time. And the last thing, I think the most important thing from this episode is intuition versus reason. I think as a society, we're undervaluing intuition, like Aashay said. And just because it's more hand wavy doesn't really mean it's less valuable. It's something that you can build over time with experience. And I think it's important to add to that as well as you have to understand what your default setting is. Like Aashay and I's default setting may be more leaning towards reason and data. And that's perfectly okay. We don't need to change that, but we may need to kind of think about like, hey, like since we're kind of on this end, let's try to correct a little more and use our intuition more. And maybe you find yourself that naturally your default setting is to follow your gut and trust your gut more. Maybe you should, in decisions, consider a little more data and reasoning. So I think it's why decision making is so unique to the individual, because everyone has their own natural tendencies and biases, but understanding where you lie on that scale, I think is really helpful, because then you can try to correct it and bring it a little more to the middle and have it be more balanced. And if you've made it this far in the podcast, thank you so much for listening. It really means a lot. If you know anyone or you yourself made an interesting decision, I'd love to hear about it, and maybe we could talk about doing an episode in the future.